Some cases don't start with sirens or bodies or screams. Some start in silence. In the back of a room no one visits, on a shelf that should have been cleared years ago. He was 6 months into the job, not yet trusted, not yet seasoned. Officer Daniel Reese didn't know what he was looking for when he pulled the file. It was a mislabel, something tagged in the system as resolved, closed, 1997, but the barcode didn't match. The box was smaller than it should have been, too light, no dust, like it had been placed there recently, though it claimed to be decades old. He set it down on the desk, opened the lid, stared. Inside were photos, printed, glossy, cataloged like any crime scene, but wrong. The timestamp was 2 weeks from now. Every photo, a woman, maybe late 20s, lying face down on kitchen tile. Her wrists were bound with red shoelaces, her nails broken, a fracture behind her ear. The angles were clean, like someone had taken their time. Everything labeled, numbered. The scale markers had current precinct logos, ones that didn't exist in '97. He checked again, then found the confession tape. Cassette, hand-labeled. When he pressed play, the voice was calm, male, describing it all, the sounds, the blood, the exact pattern the woman made when she fell. Then silence. No police report existed. No Rachel Morrigan. Not yet. But she would die, exactly as described. He should have closed the box, but he didn't. He stared at the last photo, the woman's eyes open, as if she knew this wasn't over. The box wasn't dusty because it hadn't been there long. It hadn't been sitting in some basement since 1997. It had been planted, recently. The tape hadn't warped, the photos hadn't yellowed, and the chain of custody sheet inside the folder was blank, unsigned, untouched. It was a mock investigation, processed but never reported, filed but never entered. Daniel knew enough to recognize real evidence from stagecraft, and this wasn't either. It was like someone had documented the future and sent it backward. He found Rachel's name on the forms again, printed in clear block letters with no other identifiers, no license number, no middle name, just Rachel Morrigan. He ran it through the database, but nothing came up. No active case, no missing persons, no 911 call logs. It was like she didn't exist, or like she hadn't disappeared yet. He slid the photos back into their folder and re-examined each evidence bag. The gloves were clean. The shoelaces were tied exactly as they were in the image, but the real detail was microscopic. A drop of dried blood inside one of the plastic bags had a time-stamped label that read, "Sample collected June 22nd, 2025. That was 13 days from now. Daniel checked the precinct clock again. He wasn't hallucinating. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. He reached for the nearest logbook, the physical one used to cross-reference digital files. The box's tag didn't exist in either. It was invisible, floating somewhere between present and not yet. He thought of reporting it, briefly. But how do you explain finding evidence for a murder that hasn't happened yet? How do you turn in a confession for a crime that hasn't been committed? He stared at the image again, the one with Rachel's body collapsed across the kitchen tiles, her face caught just at the edge of the frame. There was something in her expression that didn't sit right. Not fear, not confusion. She looked almost aware, not surprised to be dying, just resigned to it. Daniel had seen enough victims to know the difference. He took the entire box home that night. He didn't check it out, didn't scan it. He just carried it under his arm like it belonged to him. He told himself it was temporary, just for the night, just until he could understand what this was. He placed it on the floor of his apartment, unopened, like it might breathe if left alone. But it didn't. It just sat there, humming with possibility. He didn't sleep. The woman in the photos had taken root somewhere behind his eyes. Not because she was dead, but because, as far as he could tell, she wasn't. She was alive, somewhere, and he had been handed her future autopsy. The next morning, he searched for the name again, still no result. But he checked social media and found her. Not instantly, but after enough digging. Rachel Morrigan, 29, kindergarten teacher, Springfield, Missouri. She posted pictures of coffee mugs and second-grade spelling bees. Her face matched the photo. Her kitchen matched the crime scene. And her most recent post was from yesterday. Alive, smiling, standing in the same spot where her body would be found. She was real. The murder was real. It just hadn't happened yet. Daniel stared at her face on his screen and then back at the photo on the evidence sheet. Same eyes, same tile, same ending. Unless someone stopped it. Before we go deeper, we want to hear from you. Where are you from? Mention your country in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because this case doesn't begin with a killing. It begins with a prophecy. One buried in cardboard, waiting to come true. He wasn't supposed to contact her, not directly, not with the badge still provisional, not without a supervisor, not without protocol. But the rules didn't account for this. Daniel Reese had stared at enough dead faces during training to know this wasn't about process, it was about time, and time, for once, was the only advantage he had. He wrote down her name, her school's address, her most recent post's timestamp. Her tone online was casual, nothing out of the ordinary. She had posted a picture of her class's art wall, tagged it, "These kids own my soul," and logged off. That had been 12 hours ago. As of sunrise, her account had gone dark. He didn't want to jump, but he'd learned something in the academy. When your instincts ring twice, follow them, and his weren't ringing, they were screaming. He drove to the address listed on her faculty page. Small house, 2 steps, ceramic welcome mat with painted sunflowers. No signs of forced entry, no damage, just a wind chime, still swaying from an earlier gust. He didn't knock, not yet. He walked once around the house, checked the back door. It was locked, curtains drawn, newspaper still in the grass. He circled again, slower this time, and that's when he saw the red, not blood, a single red shoelace tied around the mailbox post, knotted, clean, just like the photo. His stomach dropped. It wasn't possible. It hadn't happened yet. She was still inside, he told himself, still breathing, still unaware, still scrolling her phone or brushing her teeth. But then the door opened. She stepped out, alive, very much alive. Her eyes met his, startled, confused, cautious. She asked if he was okay, said she didn't call anyone, asked if there was an emergency. Daniel couldn't speak at first. He tried. His voice came out too thin, like something not fully formed. He asked if her name was Rachel. She said yes. He asked if she lived alone. She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, just her. No roommates, no pets, nothing unusual. But something in her voice didn't match the photo. She wasn't the woman in the kitchen tiles. Not yet. She was softer, quieter, but still her. He asked if she'd noticed anything strange, if anyone had left anything at her door. She paused again. Her lips moved slowly this time. Someone had mailed her a cassette tape, she said. No return address, just her name on the envelope. She hadn't listened to it. No cassette player. Said it creeped her out. She was going to throw it out, but it was still inside, on her counter. Daniel asked if he could see it. He shouldn't have, but he did. She stepped back, unsure. He showed her his badge, said he wasn't here officially, that he just needed to verify something. Something very serious. Rachel stared at him for a long time, then let him in. The house was quiet, clean, identical to the photos. Same tile, same counter, same fruit bowl. The cassette sat on the edge of the sink, unopened. She handed it to him like it was radioactive. He examined the label. The handwriting was the same, Same ink, same slant. The voice on the precinct tape. It belonged to whoever had sent this. Daniel didn't ask for her permission. He played it. Same words, same tone. Only this time, it ended differently. There was a new line added, something that hadn't been on the original. After the description of her fall, after the bleach, after the sound of the jaw cracking, the voice said, "She'll see the man before she dies, but she won't stop it. She'll know, and she'll freeze." Then silence. Rachel didn't speak for a long time. She didn't ask who it was. She didn't scream. She just sat down very slowly and placed her hands on her knees. Daniel asked her when she received it. She said yesterday. It had no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. He asked if she had any enemies, anyone who knew her routine, anyone who'd hurt her before. She shook her head, said she lived boring, taught kids, ate oatmeal, didn't date much, kept to herself, the kind of life that shouldn't end in red shoelaces and duct tape. Daniel called it in, not the whole thing, just the tape. He said it was part of a potential stalking case, needed backup, needed someone to take her into protective custody. They told him to wait, to not engage further, to file it formally. But something told him that if he walked out of her house without her, she'd be dead within 48 hours. The voice on the tape wasn't a threat. It was a plan, a forecast, and every piece of it was starting to land exactly where it said it would. Rachel didn't want to leave. She said she'd never had police at her door, that she didn't want neighbors talking, that she didn't want to make this real. But it was already real. It had been documented before she heard it. She wasn't being targeted. She had been selected, scheduled, like an appointment on a calendar someone else controlled. Daniel made her pack a bag, one change of clothes, charger, ID, no explanation, just instinct. He didn't know where to take her. He just knew where not to leave her. He called his sister, said he needed a favor, brought Rachel there, had her lie low in the guest room. No phones, no press, just quiet. When he returned to the precinct, the box was gone. Shelf wiped clean. Logbook, missing the tag. Surveillance camera for that room? Disconnected. He asked 3 superiors. No one knew what he was talking about. One of them asked if he was feeling okay, told him maybe the stress was getting to him, suggested he take a few days off. He knew what that meant. They were shutting it down, or they didn't know it existed. Both were dangerous. The system had rejected the anomaly, denied the evidence, but Daniel still had the photo, the shoelace, the cassette, and Rachel. And the man who mailed a confession for a murder that hadn't happened yet was still out there, waiting for the calendar to catch up. The next day began with fog, not outside, in his head. Daniel sat in his parked car for almost an hour, engine off, staring at nothing. Rachel was safe, at least for now, but the moment he stepped back into the precinct, everything felt off. The desk sergeant didn't say hello. The coffee machine was unplugged. The hallway lights flickered when they never used to. Small things. Petty things, but they built on each other. Micro-fractures in routine. He walked back to the evidence room like nothing had changed, but the shelf was still empty. The label that should have matched the box was now reassigned to a DUI file from 2011. Neatly stamped. System verified. It was like the box never existed, but he had proof. He brought his own photocopy of the evidence tag, the one he'd made before taking the box home. He held it next to the barcode, now stapled to the shelf. Different numbers, different ink. Someone had overwritten it, quietly, deliberately. He asked 2 techs about the security camera. Both said it had been down for weeks, routine maintenance, no big deal. But that didn't match the log. Daniel had seen the feed before, 3 days ago when it was recording fine. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being erased, piece by piece. He left the building without logging his hours, drove straight to his sister's place. Rachel was still in the guest room, curled under a blanket, eyes wide open but not seeing anything. He sat beside her and didn't speak, just waited. After a while, she whispered something. "It's not the first time." He turned to her, asked what she meant. She didn't move, didn't blink. Said she had received another tape, maybe a year ago, but it hadn't been violent, just breathing, soft music. Then the sound of a drawer opening. She'd thought it was a prank, tossed it, didn't tell anyone, said she forgot, but now she remembered. The voice on this new tape, it was the same breath, the same music, the same sound of the drawer. Whoever was doing this hadn't just planned the murder. They'd practiced it. They'd been rehearsing her death in small pieces, sending her glimpses over time, like a performance leading up to the final act. Daniel asked if she had any stalkers, exes, students' parents, anyone who might have known how to push her. She shook her head, said number, then paused, said maybe. Years ago, she'd had a break-in. Nothing stolen, just her drawers opened, fridge left ajar, mattress lifted slightly like someone had looked under it. The police had filed it as a non-event. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no report made it past a single page. But now, thinking back, she wondered, was that the beginning? Was that the first time she was selected? Daniel wrote it down. Timeline, 3 years ago, break-in, 1 year ago, cassette, 2 days ago, shoelace. Each event closer than the last. Escalation, a pattern. But what chilled him most wasn't the timing, it was the precision. Whoever was behind this had mapped her life in ways even she hadn't noticed. They knew where she left her keys, when she turned off her phone, what time she slept. The confession wasn't fiction, it was choreography. He needed help, not just backup. He needed someone outside the precinct, outside the chain of command. Someone who wouldn't dismiss him as unstable or call it stress. He remembered a retired detective named Harrow, sharp, solitary, now teaching criminology at a local college. Known for noticing things no one else did. He called him, explained enough to get a meeting, left out the time-stamped future evidence. Just called it a stalking case with unusual materials. Harrow listened, said he'd meet tomorrow, asked Daniel to bring everything, every copy, every anomaly. But when Daniel went to grab the cassette from his apartment, it was gone. Not stolen, replaced. Same label, same handwriting. But when he played it, the voice was different. Same words, but recited flat. Mechanical, like it had been read by a computer. The original recording, human, intimate, cold, had been swapped for an imitation. He checked the photo printouts. Same thing. The facial expression was off. Rachel's eyes were closed now, not open. Her mouth turned slightly, just enough to suggest peace instead of pain. They weren't just erasing the evidence, they were editing it, rewriting it, controlling not just the future, but how it would be remembered. That's when he realized this wasn't about one murder. It was about authorship, narrative, ownership of the truth. And someone, somewhere, was watching every move he made and correcting the story in real time. Rachel hadn't heard the original tape. Only Daniel had, which meant the switch was personal, for him. A message. We're ahead of you. He took a photo of the fake tape, sent it to a trusted friend. In forensics, no explanation, just a text. Run this. Quietly. Then he drove. No destination, just movement. He needed to stay ahead of the edits. Every place he left behind was a potential scene. Modified, tampered, falsified. But the truth couldn't be stored anymore. It had to be remembered, embedded. And Daniel realized something dark. The only way to preserve what was real was to burn it into someone else. Rachel wasn't safe in hiding. She was safe only as long as she was a witness, as long as her memory of the truth couldn't be swapped, rewritten, or deleted. She had to remember everything. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did Rachel. They sat in silence across from each other, not talking, not resting, just watching the windows as if something might move behind them. By morning, Daniel had made a decision. If this was a rehearsal, a pre-written crime, then they had to disrupt the script. Make noise in the middle of silence. Confuse the timeline. Rachel wanted to go back to her house, but Daniel refused. He wasn't sure what would be waiting for her there, if anything. The shoelace hadn't been a warning. It had been a signature. The kind you leave at the end of a painting, not the beginning. He called Harrow again, moved their meeting up, brought Rachel with him. Harrow lived in a small brick duplex cluttered with old case files, post-it notes, and framed newspaper clippings. A detective's museum frozen in amber. He didn't offer coffee, just a chair and a notepad. He listened, said nothing for a long time, then asked only one question. "Are you sure she's not already dead?" Rachel blinked. Daniel leaned forward. What did that mean? Harrow tilted his head. "You say the tape is a confession, but what if it's a reenactment?" Daniel shook his head, said the timestamps didn't match. The box claimed a date 2 weeks in the future. Harrow nodded, but his eyes narrowed. Exactly. What if someone already did this and is remaking it? Testing how well it fits. Rachel went cold. Daniel stood up, said that didn't make sense. There was no prior Rachel Morrigan case, no open file, no old file, no duplicates. Harrow asked, "Did you check obituaries?" "Morgues." Daniel said yes. She didn't have a twin, no identity change, no witness protection history, but the seed had been planted. What if this was a copy, a second draft of something the world had already forgotten? Daniel pulled out the photo, the original one, the real one with her eyes open, laid it beside the altered version. Harrow stared. His hands didn't move, but something shifted in his face. "I've seen her," he said. Rachel froze, asked where. Harrow walked to a back room, returned with a file. Yellowed, cracked edges. Unsolved, 1994, case closed as accident. No ID on the woman. Body was discovered in an abandoned motel. Cause of death: blunt force. Trauma to the base of the skull. He slid the autopsy photo across the table. The resemblance was unnerving, not identical, but close. Same bone structure, same scar under the chin, same left side dimple. Rachel stared, pale, said she'd never seen the photo before. Harrow said the case never made it to press, was buried due to a jurisdictional error. The woman's fingerprints had been smudged, DNA degraded. No family came forward. The file had been boxed, marked, and lost. Until now. Daniel looked between the photo and Rachel. "It's not you," he said, but part of him wasn't sure. Rachel finally spoke, said she didn't have gaps in memory, no unexplained years, no medical events. But she did say one thing. When she was 14, she had a fever, woke up in a hospital, couldn't remember the 2 days prior. Her mother said she collapsed during a class trip. Dehydration. Nothing serious. But no one in her family ever mentioned which hospital it was, and she'd never asked. She hadn't thought it mattered. Until now. Daniel asked Harrow what he was suggesting. That someone had found a body in 1994 and was now remaking the crime exactly with a living version of the same woman. Harrow said he didn't know. But the confession tape, the original one, it wasn't the voice of a man reliving a fantasy. It was the voice of someone who had done it already and wanted to see it again. Daniel felt a slow burn in his chest, like being pulled towards something he didn't want to know. He left the meeting with Rachel in silence. They didn't speak until the car was already moving. Rachel whispered, "Am I supposed to die the same way she did?" Daniel didn't answer, because he didn't know, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just about her anymore. Someone had been rehearsing death for decades, curating it, perfecting it. They weren't just predicting murder, they were restaging it, like a director returning to an old set with better actors. Back at his apartment, Daniel found something taped to his door. A photo, black and white, grainy, a still frame of himself sitting in his squad car, time-stamped 11 minutes ago, meaning someone had been watching him while he met with Harrow, following, documenting. He was in the script now too. He flipped the photo over, a handwritten line, "Don't forget your part." He didn't sleep, didn't eat, just sat in the corner of his room, back against the wall, eyes never leaving the door. The next morning, Rachel called him before sunrise, her voice low, measured. "I remembered something." She said she once had a nightmare years ago where she was in a room she didn't recognize, tied up but not afraid. The walls had numbers. The carpet had a burn mark shaped like a triangle. She thought it was just a dream. Until now. Until Daniel remembered something from Harrow's file. A description of the motel room where the 1994 body was found. Walls marked with chalk. A triangle-shaped scorch on the floor. That wasn't a nightmare, it was a memory, but not hers. Not yet. The human mind isn't built for recursion. You're not supposed to remember something that hasn't happened yet. You're not supposed to fear déjà vu for a life you didn't live. But that's what Rachel was facing now. Memories she never made. Images she never saw were surfacing like sediment from a lake bed stirred by an unseen force. Daniel didn't say it out loud, but he knew they were no longer just looking at a future crime. They were looking at an echo. Someone had done this before, killed someone who looked like Rachel, in the same way, in the same place. And now, years later, they were bringing the play back for a second act, only this time with a conscious audience. Rachel, the woman who shouldn't exist. Harrow called it a ghost pattern, crimes that repeat not because of copycats, but because the original never ended. Like an unfinished sentence, someone returns to decades later, refusing to let go of the last word. Daniel spread out the photos again, the real ones, the altered ones. He laid them side by side in the order they'd been discovered, from the shoelace to the taped confession to the edited stills. There was a structure. He could see it now. It wasn't just a collection of evidence. It was a storyboard, a planned composition, every image a scene, every timestamp a rehearsal mark. But for whom? Who needed this crime to be perfect? That question haunted him more than the box itself, because whoever was directing this show didn't just want to kill. They wanted to be understood. They wanted recognition. And the scariest thing about that kind of killer is not the violence, it's the patience. Rachel couldn't sleep anymore. She started writing things down. Dreams, fragments, smells, the sound of metal against tile, the texture of the shoelace. She began describing the weight of air in places she'd never been, dim rooms with wood-paneled walls, or peeling wallpaper behind broken fans. Daniel realized she was slipping into the memory of someone else, the original victim. The woman in the 1994 file, whoever she had been, she was merging now with Rachel, overlapping through time. That night, Daniel went to the address listed on the 1994 motel case. The building had been bulldozed, a gas station stood in its place, but something about the land felt wrong. He walked behind the building, flashlight in hand, and found a fenced-off concrete slab, the last piece of the old motel's foundation. On it, someone had spray-painted a number, 2379. No context, No explanation, just a date, a code, a room number. Daniel took a photo, sent it to Harrow. An hour later, Harrow replied, 2379, NYPD cold file number. Look it up. He did. It was a missing persons case from 2003. A woman, no connection to Rachel, but the photo in the file made his skin crawl. She looked almost like Rachel. Again, different hair, different height, but the same core structure, cheekbones, eye shape, chin. Her name was Caroline Mercer. Last seen leaving a library, disappeared without a trace. Case unsolved. Daniel started digging, found 2 more files, 1985, 2009. Same pattern. Women who looked eerily similar, all killed or vanished. Spaced apart by almost exactly a decade, always a new city, always just obscure enough to avoid pattern recognition. Until now. Until Rachel. Harrow called it ghost pattern. But this wasn't just one person mimicking a crime. It was one mind staging the same woman over and over again in different bodies. Daniel stared at the timeline on his wall. Red string, thumbtacks, names, all orbiting the same center. Rachel, or whoever Rachel represented. An archetype, an ideal. The killer wasn't stalking a person. They were stalking a concept, a type, and every time they got closer to perfecting it. Daniel realized that Rachel's murder wasn't just planned, it was inevitable, because in this killer's mind, it had already happened 4 times before, and now it had to happen again. Not for rage, not for lust, but for completion. The final scene. That night, Rachel had another memory, a hospital tray, an oxygen mask, a man sitting by her bed, whispering something over and over. She couldn't hear the words, but the rhythm stuck in her head. She hummed it for Daniel. He froze. It was the same rhythm used on the cassette tape, the breathing, the speech pacing. He asked her to hum it again, then again. He recorded it, ran it through sound recognition software. It wasn't just rhythm, it was speech, slowed down, distorted, hidden beneath her memory like a watermark. When reversed and cleaned up, it formed one sentence. You are the 5th. Daniel played it 10 times before he spoke. That wasn't a hallucination. That wasn't trauma. That was programming. Someone had sat by her hospital bed when she was a child and planted that phrase subconsciously, which meant this whole timeline stretched back decades, possibly to her birth. Rachel wasn't being targeted randomly. She had been cultivated. This wasn't a murder investigation anymore. It was a case about design, about a victim being prepared across time. Daniel felt sick, because if this person, this director, had access to her since childhood, they had access to others too. The previous victims, all of them may have been watched, molded, selected not just for their looks, but for how well they fit the evolving script. Daniel stared at the red string on his wall. One question sat at the center now, circled in black ink. What if Rachel isn't the final version, just the next rehearsal? Because the killer hadn't been stopped. They were still moving, still building, still writing. And maybe they didn't even need to kill Rachel anymore. Maybe she'd already served her purpose. Or maybe the final scene was still coming, and Daniel himself was part of it. There's a difference between murder and theater. One silences a life, the other scripts it. But in this case, they blurred. The closer Daniel got to the center of the pattern, the more it resembled performance. Every victim, every detail, every decision made not in rage or panic, but with the precision of a filmmaker. He started calling the killer the director in his notes, not because he knew who they were, but because he knew what they wanted. Control, repetition, refinement. Like they weren't killing for satisfaction, but for symmetry, each version closer to the perfect scene. Rachel had become the 5th iteration, not a person, but a role. And maybe, Daniel feared, so had he. He looked back through everything. The mislabeled evidence box, the timed delivery of the photos, the exactness of the tape, and realized none of it had been an accident. He hadn't found the case. It had been given to him, selected, placed. Like an actor being handed a script without realizing he'd been cast. He returned to the evidence box again, this time noticing something he'd missed. A small folded piece of yellow paper tucked inside the cassette sleeve. It was blank at first, but when tilted toward light, faint pencil indents revealed a single line. Scene 6, don't look away. Not a threat, a direction. The kind you give to someone on set. Daniel felt a chill in his bones. If this was scene 6, how many scenes were left? He didn't sleep, just drove. Through neighborhoods he didn't recognize, past buildings that felt familiar, even when they weren't. Until he ended up at an old movie theater on the edge of town, boarded up, forgotten, but still standing. Its marquee read nothing, just chipped paint and silence. He wasn't sure why he stopped there, but something in him said it mattered. The front doors were locked, but the side entrance gave way with a shove. Inside, dust, cracked tile, and the faint smell of mold. Rows of red velvet seats rotted at the edges, a stage, a screen, and behind the curtain, a dark hallway. He walked it slowly, flashlight in hand, until he reached a projection booth. Empty, except for one thing, a file box, the same kind he'd found at the station. He opened it. Inside, photos, not of victims, of him, taken from behind as he walked to his car. Standing at the precinct coffee machine, sitting in Rachel's living room, each labeled Daniel Reese, Scene 1, Scene 2, Scene 3. He felt the air tighten. Someone had been watching not just Rachel, but him, for weeks, maybe longer. This wasn't just a murder story anymore. It was his story, and someone else had already written it. He ran from the building, called Harrow, told him what he found. Harrow listened, didn't speak for a long time, then said, "I think you were chosen for a reason." Daniel asked why. Harrow said, "Because you follow the script." He didn't know what that meant, not yet. But when he got home, there was another envelope on his doormat. Plain white. No name. Inside, a single Polaroid. Rachel, tied, unconscious, in what looked like a kitchen. Not her kitchen, but the one from the original photos. The one Daniel had been trying to prevent. She was still alive. The timestamp said, tomorrow, 2:37 a.m. That meant he had less than 30 hours. But where was it? The kitchen, the tiles. They didn't match any known property she owned. He called dispatch. Asked them to search property tax records, condemned homes, rentals, motels, anything that fit the pattern. He didn't wait for an answer. He started driving again, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, looking for a house that shouldn't exist. A kitchen he'd never seen but somehow recognized. That night, he found one. Empty, dusty. For sale sign rusted through. He broke in, the floor tiles, identical, red laces on the floor, a single chair in the center of the room, a video camera mounted in the corner. No Rachel, but a note taped to the chair. "You're early, scene 7 begins tomorrow." That was when it hit him. This wasn't a murder plan. It was a production schedule. Every piece had been laid out like a film. Locations scouted, victims rehearsed, timelines arranged, and the killer wasn't working alone. This level of orchestration required logistics, transportation, access, maybe a whole network, or maybe just one very precise mind. Daniel called Harrow again, told him what he found. Harrow didn't sound surprised, said, "Some killers stab in the dark. This one builds stages," and Daniel was standing right in the center of one. He wanted to pull out, Call backup, issue a citywide alert. But something told him if he broke the pattern, Rachel would die. That was the unspoken contract. Follow the script or watch it play out without you. He stayed, waited, slept in his car outside the house, set an alarm for 2 a.m. And when he re-entered the building just after 2:15, the chair was no longer empty. It was the same room, the same chair, but not the same arrangement. The red shoelaces were gone. The floor had been cleaned, scrubbed so hard the grout still smelled like bleach. And in the center, instead of Rachel, sat a TV. Old, boxy, the kind with a dial. Its screen flickered to life the moment Daniel stepped inside. No remote, no power cord visible, just static that cleared into an image. Himself. Recorded footage. He was standing in this exact room, same clothes, same stance. But the timestamp in the corner read 2:38 a.m., 4 minutes into the future. He stepped forward, watching the screen, and the figure on it mirrored him, delayed by seconds. It wasn't just footage, it was live. A surveillance loop from somewhere else in the house, feeding back to him. But from where? He started searching, through the halls, the basement, each room staged and empty, each with some trace of presence left behind. A burner phone left charging, a cup of cold coffee, a closet full of identical jackets, all his size. The more he walked, the more it felt like he was stepping into a version of his own life. Not recreated exactly, but reconstructed in pieces. Like someone had been studying him not just to watch, but to imitate. Upstairs, he found the source of the feed. A camera mounted above the bedroom door, aimed down toward the hallway. The screen downstairs wasn't showing him in real time. It was showing him as he would be soon. A delay that made no technical sense. He unplugged the camera. The screen in the kitchen stayed on, still showing him, still ahead. That was when he realized he wasn't being watched anymore. He was being predicted. Someone had studied him so long, so intimately, that they could reconstruct his movements before he made them. Not just his schedule, but his instincts, his muscle memory, his hesitation. The script was no longer about Rachel. It was about him. The director had shifted the spotlight, and Daniel, whether he liked it or not, had become the lead. He left the house just before 3 a.m., got into his car, and didn't drive. He sat, let the cold creep through the windshield. He needed to know, had Rachel been here? Had she been in that chair? Or was the photo just another prompt, another piece of staging to keep him moving? He checked again. No evidence she'd ever been inside. No DNA, no hair, no blood. The only thing left behind was a folded receipt for a hardware store 2 towns over. He traced it the next morning. Security footage showed a woman buying duct tape, plastic sheeting, gloves. No face visible, hooded, cash purchase. But the posture was familiar. Not Rachel. Him. His own stride, his own gait. The director was copying him now, using his image to build the next scene. He called Harrow, told him everything. Harrow said only one thing. Then you're not hunting him anymore, you're chasing yourself. The precinct had started noticing too, files missing, cameras turned off at key moments, Daniel's name popping up on logs he hadn't accessed. Someone was rewriting his presence in the system, smearing his identity, slowly, precisely, like a backup plan was already in motion. If Rachel's murder didn't happen, Daniel would be the story instead. A cop who went rogue, who found a cold case and broke protocol, who lost his mind inside a fictional murder. The box hadn't just been bait, it was an alibi for the killer. A decoy narrative that would bury the real one, unless Daniel solved it first. He made a list of everyone who'd touched the case, everyone who'd accessed the evidence room in the last month. Names, schedules, backgrounds. One stood out, a forensics tech named Alton Ridge, new hire, clean record, but no prior employment, no social media, no photos, just a resume, and one reference, Harrow. Daniel confronted him. Harrow didn't flinch, said Ridge was cleared, said background checks don't always leave digital footprints. But Daniel had already dug deeper, found an archived surveillance tape from 6 months ago, Harrow shaking hands with a man in a hooded coat outside the old theater. No sound, no timestamp, but the face matched Ridge. Daniel didn't accuse him, not yet, just asked for space. Harrow said to be careful. Daniel knew what that meant. The walls were closing. The real game was beginning. And whoever was behind it wasn't afraid of proximity anymore. They had already inserted themselves into the precinct. The investigation. His life. That night, Rachel called. First time in 3 days. Her voice was different, slower, like she wasn't sure if she was supposed to be speaking. She said, "I had a dream I was buried alive, but I could hear someone talking over the dirt, reading lines." Daniel asked what lines. She said, "My name, over and over, like they were trying to remember it." Then the line went dead. He traced the number. Burner phone, last pinged near the old theater. He drove there again. It was empty, but on the projection screen was a single image, Rachel's autopsy photo. Only she wasn't dead. Her eyes were open, watching the camera, and taped over the bottom of the screen was a single typed sentence. "The role has been accepted." Daniel stepped back, sat in the third row, alone, and whispered the only thing he hadn't dared admit out loud until now. "I think she's already dead." But even that didn't feel true, because deep down he wasn't sure if Rachel had ever existed at all. Names hold weight, but only if they belong to someone real. Daniel sat with that thought long after the theater screen went dark. Rachel Morrigan. The name had shaped everything since the box arrived. Her death was the hook, her survival the twist, and now her existence itself had become the lie. He went back to the precinct, logged into birth records, census data, hospital registries. There were 3 Rachel Morrigans born in the state in the last 30 years. One was a nurse living in Oregon. One died in infancy. The third, no trace beyond a high school yearbook photo from 2005. And even that was suspect. Her face oddly generic, like stock photography printed in monochrome. He reverse searched it. Nothing. No family photos, no college enrollment, no bank records. Rachel wasn't missing. She had never been found. And that made Daniel realize something even worse. The murder scene, the kitchen, the red laces, the angle of the body. It was all designed not to kill someone real, but to emulate a murder we'd believe. Because belief is what makes a crime real in the public mind. And someone had engineered this case to pass every test, visual, procedural, emotional, to replicate the aesthetics of tragedy without needing an actual victim. Daniel had been chasing a simulation, a ghost engineered for empathy. That explained why the confession tape was so clean, why the crime scene markers had modern logos despite claiming to be from 1997, why the victim had no digital footprint but just enough visual plausibility to stir doubt. She wasn't a person. She was a placeholder, a character cast to provoke the question, what if this were true? And Daniel had taken the bait because the system is trained to chase patterns, not truth. That's when he remembered something from the tape, a moment where the voice said almost casually, "This is where the scream would go," not did go, would. Like it was being workshopped, directed, drafted. That wasn't a confession. It was a storyboard, a killer designing a template for future crimes. And Daniel, unknowingly, had become the editor. He pulled every old cold case with matching signatures, red shoelaces, fracture behind the ear, hands bound. He found 4, all open, all inconclusive, each with small anomalies, conflicting timestamps, evidence photos that looked overly staged, victim details that didn't align with next of kin. He pinned them on the wall, side by side. Then something else struck him. In every case, the first responding officer had no prior connection to the precinct, either transferred recently or on temporary assignment. They were all new, like him, rookies with no authority to question inconsistencies. Easy to dismiss, easier to manipulate. It wasn't just about staging a crime, it was about choosing the right witness. Someone whose testimony wouldn't change protocol, but whose involvement would lend credibility to the fiction. And now, Daniel was the final piece. If he walked into the next scene, it would validate the narrative, make it real. And that's why the director had been feeding him clues, not to help him solve anything, but to lead him to the next act, a ritual of credibility. Daniel realized it wasn't about murder. It was about authorship. Whoever was behind this didn't just want to kill. They wanted to write history, to direct memory. And Daniel, by chasing it, was helping them do exactly that. He sat back, breathing hard, staring at the board. Red strings, victim photos, case files. They all looked real, felt real, but so does a movie in the dark. So does a nightmare while you sleep. He needed verification, not just paper trails. He needed touch. So he drove to the morgue, pulled records, asked to see one of the older victims, Eliza Merrick, age 26, found dead in 2015. Her body had been autopsied, stored, cremated. But before that, there was a fingerprint card. He scanned it, sent it through the system, waited, and the return shattered him. The fingerprint matched a woman who renewed her driver's license last year. Different name, different state, alive, and now very afraid. He called her. She refused to speak, said she didn't want to go through it again. Daniel begged, asked what she meant. She said, "They told me I'd be safe if I disappeared. That's the deal. You play the part, then you leave." He asked who they were. She hung up. He sat in silence for hours, trying to process what that meant. Victims who weren't victims. Deaths that weren't real. People participating in their own disappearances. And behind it all, a network, a system of performance, of chosen ghosts. If Rachel existed, she might be alive too, somewhere, hidden, or worse, watching. The next morning, he got an unmarked envelope on his windshield. Inside, a VHS tape, hand-labeled, Scene 8. He had no VCR, found one in evidence storage, played it in the break room while everyone else was gone. The tape was grainy, night vision, a camera hidden in a corner, Rachel again, tied, conscious, mouthing something he couldn't hear. Then the frame panned. Daniel's face, not shocked, not rescuing, participating. The timestamp was dated tomorrow. At 4 a.m., he paused the tape, looked at his own image. It didn't look altered. It looked real, like he'd been there, would be there. That's when it hit him. He wasn't being watched. He was being inserted. The director had crossed the final threshold. They weren't just directing the crime. They were editing reality, writing him into it, and if he didn't stop it soon, everyone else would believe it too. By the time Daniel arrived at the station the next morning, the surveillance cameras had already been wiped. Internal servers were glitching, logs overwritten with scrambled strings of characters that looked like corrupted file names. But when retyped, spelled out exact GPS coordinates. His apartment, the old theater, the morgue, every place he'd gone. every place he'd spoken aloud. It was no longer a matter of being followed. Someone had been there before him. The anticipation wasn't just tactical, it was personal. Daniel felt it everywhere now, in the way his coffee tasted off, in the way his locker combination had changed, in the way his badge now read detective when he had never been promoted. Reality was being tampered with in microscopic increments, like the world was rehearsing for a version of him he hadn't agreed to play. And yet he couldn't stop. He needed to know how far it went, how much was still real. So he did something he hadn't done in weeks. He called his mother, asked if she remembered his graduation, the year, the location, the weather. She paused, said, "That was the year your father died, wasn't it?" Daniel's father was alive, living in Michigan. They'd spoken last Christmas, but when he called the number, it was disconnected. No forwarding line, no social media, no listings, just silence. That's when the nausea hit. Deep, slow, chemical. Like memory wasn't something you held onto anymore. It was something that could be reprogrammed. He called his own doctor, asked for a physical copy of his blood type, medical history. They said they had no records of him as a patient, and yet he had prescriptions on file, had signed forms. Something was rewriting him out of his own life, piece by piece, a controlled erasure, and at the center of it all, Rachel. Not the woman, but the idea of her, the face on the tape, the name in the box. She had become a trigger for the entire chain of events, and now he didn't know if she was a victim, a conspirator, or simply another actor playing a part. Because that was what this had always been. A stage, a performance of murder, investigation, panic, and guilt, and he was the audience, the cast, and the final critic, all in one. He drove back to the theater at nightfall, parked 2 blocks away, entered on foot. There was a new note taped to the box office glass. Scene 9, showtime, 4 a.m. That timestamp again. Always 4 a.m. He waited, sat in the back row, watched the lights dim, the projector click. The screen lit up. Not a video, a live feed. His own living room, his couch, his lamp, and on it, Rachel, sitting cross-legged, reading a file, smiling. It wasn't pre-recorded. It was happening right now. He bolted, drove without blinking, kicked open his own door. She was gone. No trace, no fingerprints, but the window latch had been moved, and on the kitchen table sat a fresh Polaroid. Him, asleep, time stamped at 4:01 a.m. He never remembered falling asleep, never remembered the photo being taken, but there it was, glossy, real. He brought it to the precinct, asked for fingerprint analysis. The lab tech said it had already been processed, days ago. In his handwriting, he checked the system. The entry existed. Daniel Reese, evidence processed, tagged, archived. He asked to see the box. They brought it up from storage, opened it. Inside, the Polaroid, the VHS tape, the burner phone, a second photo of Rachel, alive, standing beside him at a gas station he'd never visited. He was being compiled, archived, like his life was already a case file. And the only thing missing now was the crime. Harrow pulled him aside later that night, quiet, calm, asked if he was sleeping, asked if he needed leave. Daniel said no. Harrow nodded, then handed him a sealed manila folder. No return address. No log of who dropped it off. Daniel opened it alone in his car. Inside, a single-page script. No heading, just dialogue. 2 lines. One said, "You don't remember me, but I've always remembered you." The second, "That's why this time, I'll get it right." No names, no context. But on the back, scribbled in pencil, a list of numbers, coordinates again. This time, they pointed to an old motel on the outskirts of town. Room 17. He arrived just past midnight. No car in the lot. The door was cracked open. Inside, no person, no signs of life, just mirrors, dozens of them, standing, hanging, leaned against every wall, and in every reflection, Rachel, a different version, smiling, crying, bleeding, one tied up, one holding a knife, one watching him with no expression at all. He smashed one mirror, then another, then stopped. Behind the shards was drywall, and behind that, insulation. Inside it, a hidden compartment with another photo. Him again, but this time in the morgue, standing over a body, his hand holding a tag, Rachel Morrigan, deceased, 4 a.m., his own signature on the toe tag. That was the last piece, the final twist. He wasn't being dragged into the murder. He was being cast as the one who solved it. A detective so obsessed with the case, he invented the victim, faked the death, fabricated evidence, and convinced the entire precinct it was real. That was the narrative being built, slowly, carefully, frame by frame. If he stayed on this path, if he kept chasing Rachel, that's how they'd remember him. Not as a whistleblower, as a forger, a criminal, a man who lost his mind inside a case that never existed. And now, he had one choice left: to destroy the story or finish it himself. There's a moment in every story where the protagonist believes they're still in control, that their choices matter, that if they just connect the next clue, say the right words, catch the next thread, they'll escape. But Daniel was past that. He understood now that this wasn't his story. It never had been. He was a variable in someone else's equation, a cast member unaware the final scene had already been blocked, the ending rehearsed before he even opened the first box. But knowing didn't mean accepting. It just meant he was finally dangerous. He stopped going to the precinct. His access card stopped working anyway. His phone no longer connected to the department server. His badge wouldn't scan. Co-workers who once nodded in passing now looked confused when they saw him, as if they'd been told he had transferred, or worse, as if they'd never known him at all. The erasure had moved from data to memory, reality itself folding around the story being told. But stories leave seams, and Daniel began tugging at one. There was a single element none of the evidence could fake: the confession tape's voice. Not its words, its tone, the cadence, the breath, the way it carried a Midwest flattening of vowels. He took it to a friend in audio forensics. Unofficially, they filtered it, analyzed vocal markers, ran it against known databases. It didn't match any registered felon, but it matched something else: a podcast, obscure, true crime adjacent, one hosted by an anonymous voice known only as the director. The podcast had only aired 6 episodes before vanishing. But in each one, the speaker described hypothetical murders in surgical detail, right down to post-mortem lividity and victim profile scripting. It was pitched as fiction. But Daniel recognized the phrasing. The confession tape hadn't been a standalone. It was episode 7. He dug deeper, found out the podcast had been pulled not for violence, but for breach of sealed case details. Information that, at the time, no civilian should have had. The source was never traced, but the IP address had pinged from a place Daniel knew well: the evidence room server at his own precinct, accessed once from a guest login. That's when it all snapped into place. This wasn't a killer hiding, it was a killer broadcasting, using crime fiction as cover, floating trial runs to see which version of the narrative felt most real, then executing the best draft. Every scene Daniel had chased wasn't improvised. It had been voted on, curated, test-audienced in podcast form before becoming reality. That made the director not just a murderer, but a showrunner. And Daniel He was about to be the finale. He called the audio lab, asked them to overlay all 6 podcast episodes, said he was looking for one thing, a cough, something human, something spontaneous. They found it. Episode 3, timestamp 2217. A cough followed by a chair squeak. He filtered it, isolated the background noise, sent it to a friend in audio modeling. She called him back, breathless. "That's your old break room, the chair with the cracked wheel." Daniel hadn't used that chair in years, but the sound was unmistakable. The podcast hadn't been recorded remotely. It was recorded inside the precinct, which meant the director wasn't just watching the investigation, he was part of it. Or had been. Daniel pulled every name that had left the department in the last 2 years, cross-checked them with media experience, tech fluency, psychological flags. One name pinged, Marcus Blaine, former PR liaison, quiet, brilliant. Left suddenly after a suspension that was never logged officially. Daniel pulled his file. It was missing. Asked records. They said Marcus had never worked there, but Daniel had emails, printed ones, meeting notes, employee photos. Blaine was real, had been erased like everything else, but not completely. There was one place the system couldn't delete, a self-storage facility Blaine had paid for monthly, auto-renewed, under an alias. Daniel found it. Broke in. Unit 314. Inside, hundreds of VHS tapes, labeled by date, not title. Most were blank or corrupted, but one, July 9th, 4 a.m., showed Daniel sleeping in his own bed. Next to him, Rachel, alive, awake, eyes wide open, staring at the camera. The timestamp blinked, then reset. 3:59, then 4:01, then vanished. Time was breaking down inside the footage, editing itself, the narrative destabilizing. Daniel realized that wasn't a glitch, it was a warning. The director was beginning to loop, rewriting the same story with slight variations until he got the perfect cut, the evidence box, the fake crime, the false memory, and Daniel? He was either the killer or the one who failed to stop it. The final tape was already written. It just hadn't been filmed yet. And in the director's world, that meant one thing. It was time for the climax. He looked back at the box, then at the mirrored ceiling of the storage unit. For the first time, he saw something new, red marker above the bulb. A single line. "You were always part of the script." And that's when he knew. The only way to stop it wasn't to find Rachel or the director. It was to not show up to the final scene, to refuse the part. Because if he walked into that last room, the murder wouldn't just happen, it would be believed. And in true crime, that's all that matters. He didn't sleep that night. Sleep felt like a trap now, a place where time skipped and footage rewrote itself and people appeared beside him with eyes wide open and breathing too calmly. Instead, he sat on his apartment floor with every piece of evidence laid out like a shrine. The box, the tape, the photos, the Polaroid, the manila envelope, the printed emails, the time-stamped mirrors, the director's podcast waveform, analyzed frame by frame, each one a signature disguised as sound. He realized that none of it pointed to guilt or innocence, only to authorship. That was the director's game all along. It wasn't about committing the perfect murder. It was about composing the perfect narrative of one. A narrative so immersive, so sensory, so meticulously threaded with time loops and erased identities and falsified memories that the audience, the department, the press, the public, would believe it over reality. Daniel was no longer playing a role in someone's story. He was the story, which meant the only weapon left was contradiction. He began creating a new file, not a report, not a confession, but a contradiction, a parallel script, something that could fracture belief. He recorded a video, laid it all out, calmly, precisely, naming dates, anomalies, showing physical evidence, matching timestamps to podcast episodes, mapping GPS coordinates. Then he uploaded it, not to police servers, not to press, but to 20 unlisted links, spread across forums, cloud storage, independent investigators. Redundancy was survival now, because even if one version was deleted, others would remain. Then he disabled every device in his home, phone, laptop, even his doorbell cam. The final piece was deciding whether to go to room 17, the location left for the final scene. He knew what would happen if he did. The director had choreographed it from the beginning. If Daniel walked in, Rachel would be dead. He'd find her that way. There would be blood, not graphic, not excessive, just enough. Her wrist would be bound, the tile clean, a single camera mounted on the wall, time-stamped 4 a.m. The tape would play, the voice would be his, the signature would be his. And by the time Internal Affairs finished their audit, the podcast episodes would disappear, the box would vanish, and he'd be left with one conclusion. He broke, invented a murder, then committed it. He would be a headline, a cautionary tale, a man lost inside his own obsession. But if he didn't go, if he stayed home, locked the doors, waited it out, then what? Would Rachel live? Was she ever real? Could he save someone who might have never existed outside VHS static and false memory? That was the last move in the director's script, the illusion of choice. Whether Daniel showed up or not, the ending had already been filmed, and that terrified him. Because the truth didn't matter anymore, only the recording did. He drove anyway, but not to room 17, to the precinct. One last time, not as an officer, not as a detective, but as a variable refusing to collapse into the outcome written for him. He walked past the front desk, past the empty squad room, into the basement archive. He brought the original evidence box, not the copies, not the newer ones. The first one, the one that started everything, the one that didn't match any barcode, wasn't in the log, didn't belong. He placed it on the center table, took a photo, uploaded it in real time to every forensic crime group online, captioned it, "Evidence submitted without origin. Tag all inconsistencies. This is not fiction." Then he stepped back, left the building, didn't say a word. The next day, over 100 independent analysts had flagged details, timestamp anomalies, precinct logo mismatches, gear that didn't exist in the era the file claimed to come from. Daniel's name became a trending topic, not as a suspect, but as someone asking a better question. Who wrote this? He didn't know how long it would last, if the director had more scenes, more edits, more people willing to play along. But for the first time, Daniel had inserted noise into the script. A crack, a stutter, a moment where the viewer had to pause and process. That was enough. Because true crime isn't just about what happened. It's about what people believe happened. And if the director's power was in belief, then Daniel's only weapon left was disbelief. The refusal to follow the script, the willingness to break character, the courage to leave the final page unread. That night, he drove 3 hours north, rented a room under another name, watched the news play a muted segment about anonymous whistleblower evidence, and turned it off. Sleep still didn't come, but silence did. And in that silence, something like clarity. Maybe the murder was still coming. Maybe it had already happened. Maybe he was next. But maybe, just maybe, that was the wrong question. Because the real story was never about death. It was about who got to write it. 3 weeks passed with no headline, no arrest, no body. just silence. Not the kind that follows resolution, but the kind that precedes it. Heavy, unfinished, waiting to exhale. The director hadn't resurfaced. No new episodes, no emails, no more boxes. As if the machine had shut down, or worse, simply moved on to someone else. Daniel kept moving too. He changed locations every few days, using burner phones, paying in cash, deleting browser histories before they even loaded. He wasn't running from the law, he was running from conclusion, because the moment he stopped, someone would write the ending for him. Maybe that was the point all along. He began rereading old case notes from other precincts, revisiting unsolved files from a decade ago, looking for patterns. Any pattern, not just of crime, but of authorship. Cases where the narrative felt too clean, statements that sounded rehearsed, photos framed like film stills. There were more than a few: a drowning victim placed with arms outstretched in symmetry, a suicide staged in front of an unlit candle, a supposed robbery where the objects taken spelled out initials when cross-referenced. Not evidence of a motive, evidence of design, and it clicked. The director wasn't obsessed with murder, he was obsessed with storytelling. Death was just the medium, and Daniel hadn't been the first. Just the first to notice. That meant there were others. Victims, yes, but also readers. People who saw the shape of the narrative but dismissed it as coincidence. He began reaching out carefully. Anonymous posts in deep web forums, true crime subcultures, Reddit threads buried under years of digital dust. The replies trickled in slowly, then faster. People who remembered details that didn't match. Listeners who had archived the missing podcast episodes. A woman in Portland who swore her brother disappeared after trying to investigate a box that arrived at his dorm labeled "Rewrite." A retired detective who kept a list of crimes that never officially happened but haunted his dreams in perfect sequence. Daniel started compiling it all, not to solve anything, but to map the reach, to see how far the fiction had bled into the real. There were gaps, of course, missing time, interviews no longer accessible, photos that appeared altered months after being uploaded. Some days, Daniel questioned if he'd made it all up, if grief or obsession or paranoia had driven him into a rabbit hole that never existed. But then a package arrived. No return address, just a plain black envelope with a red wax seal, an old-fashioned touch, too intentional to be random. Inside, a photograph, not glossy, matte, film grain. It was Daniel, standing outside the archive room holding the original box. The timestamp was not 3 weeks ago, it was tomorrow. He flipped it over. One line written in pen: "We finish what we start." No signature, just that. He stared at it for a long time. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. The director wasn't gone. He'd just paused the story, waiting to see if Daniel would pick it back up, waiting to see if he still believed he had a choice. He thought about burning it, about walking away for real this time. But he didn't. He scanned it, uploaded it to every person he'd connected with, captioned it, "Do not let this disappear," because that's what the director wanted most. Silence. Unwitnessed endings. Crimes that played like fiction until no one believed they had happened at all. But Daniel understood now. In true crime, survival isn't just about living. It's about documenting, about leaving a trail so loud, so layered, that no edit can erase it. He doesn't know what comes next. Whether Rachel ever lived, whether he was meant to be the villain or the whistleblower, or just a ghost in someone else's reel. But he knows the director is still writing, and that's enough to keep him alert, because the next story won't start with a scream. It won't start with a body. It won't start with blood. It'll start with something quieter, something easy to miss. A timestamp, a chair squeak, A voice that sounds almost familiar, and by the time anyone notices, it'll be too late. The evidence box will already be packed, the tape already labeled, the ending already filmed, but not sentenced. Not yet.